It was a quiet Tuesday morning in the small town of Crestwood. The kind of morning where the sun barely peeked through the clouds, and the streets were still damp from the night's rain. The kind of morning where nothing ever happened. Until it did. A black sedan rolled slowly down Maple Avenue, its windows tinted so dark you couldn't see inside. Inside that car sat Marcus Johnson, a man who looked like any other on the surface, but carried a secret that would soon turn this sleepy town upside down. Marcus wasn't just passing through Crestwood. He was there for a reason. A reason so explosive it would shatter lives and expose truths no one was ready to face. But before any of that could happen, the unthinkable occurred. Blue and red lights flashed in his rearview mirror. His heart sank. He knew what was coming next. Officer Dan Harris and his partner, Officer Mike Reynolds, had been patrolling the area when they spotted the sedan. To them, it looked out of place. Too sleek, too quiet, too suspicious. They didn't know who Marcus was, and they didn't care. All they saw was a black man driving a car that, in their minds, he couldn't possibly afford. It didn't take long for the situation to escalate. A routine traffic stop turned into a heated exchange, and before Marcus could explain himself, he was handcuffed and shoved into the back of their squad car. "You're coming with us," Harris sneered, his voice dripping with arrogance. What they didn't know was that Marcus wasn't just any man. He was a CIA agent, deep undercover, and this was the last place he wanted to be. But he couldn't tell them that. Not yet. As the days turned into weeks, Marcus found himself trapped in a nightmare. The officers, convinced they had caught a criminal, began fabricating evidence to pin a string of unsolved robberies on him. They planted a gun in his car, doctored surveillance footage, and even coerced a local drug addict into falsely identifying Marcus as the culprit. To them, it was an open and shut case. They had no idea who they were messing with. Marcus, however, wasn't about to go down without a fight. From behind bars, he began piecing together a plan, one that would expose the corruption festering within the Crestwood Police Department. But time was running out. His trial was fast approaching, and if he didn't act soon, he'd be spending the rest of his life in prison for crimes he didn't commit. The courtroom was packed on the day of the trial. Reporters lined the walls, eager to capture every moment of what was being dubbed the trial of the century. Marcus sat at the defense table, his face calm but his mind racing. Across the room, Harris and Reynolds exchanged smug glances, confident in their victory. The prosecution presented their case, painting Marcus as a dangerous criminal who had terrorized the town. But then, it was Marcus's turn. His lawyer stood, a sly smile playing on her lips. "Your Honor," she began, "we'd like to call a surprise witness to the stand." The room fell silent as the doors swung open, and in walked a man in a sharp suit, his badge gleaming in the light. The gasps were audible. It was Marcus's handler from the CIA, and he had evidence that would blow the case wide open. But before he could speak, Harris jumped to his feet, his face red with rage. "This is a setup," he shouted, pointing an accusing finger at Marcus. "He's lying. He's trying to frame us." The judge slammed his gavel, demanding order, but the full tension in the room was palpable. Marcus's handler stepped forward, a folder in his hand. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "what I'm about to reveal will not only prove Marcus Johnson's innocence, but also expose a conspiracy that goes far beyond this courtroom." The room held its breath. What was in that folder? What secrets was he about to unveil? And most importantly, what would happen when the truth finally exploded? The answers would come, but not yet. For now, the tension hung thick in the air, a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Marcus's handler, Agent Thomas Grayson, stood at the front of the room, his presence commanding silence. The folder in his hand seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds, its contents holding the power to unravel everything. Marcus sat still, his eyes locked on Grayson. He had trusted this man with his life more times than he could count. But this was different. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about justice and the truth. Grayson opened the folder slowly, deliberately, as if giving the room one last moment to brace itself. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady but carrying an edge of urgency. "Marcus Johnson is not the criminal the prosecution has made him out to be. He is a decorated CIA operative, currently on a classified mission that required him to be in Crestwood. The evidence against him has been fabricated by officers Harris and Reynolds, who have a history of misconduct that has been systematically covered up by the Crestwood Police Department." The gasps returned, louder this time. Harris's face turned pale, and Reynolds clenched his fists, his knuckles white. The judge leaned forward, his expression a mix of disbelief and curiosity. "Agent Grayson," he said slowly, "these are serious allegations. Do you have proof?" Grayson nodded and pulled a stack of documents from the folder. "This," he said, holding up the first page, "is a sworn affidavit from a former Crestwood officer who witnessed Harris and Reynolds planting evidence in multiple cases, including Marcus's. This," he continued, lifting another document, "is a financial record showing unexplained deposits into both officers' bank accounts, coinciding with the dates of several high-profile arrests. And this," he added, his voice growing sharper, "is a recording of a conversation between Harris and Reynolds discussing their plan to frame Marcus." The room erupted. Reporters scrambled to take notes. Cameras clicked furiously, and the judge pounded his gavel, demanding order. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. The tide was turning. But Harris wasn't ready to back down. "This is all lies," he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of his anger. "That recording is fake. They're trying to discredit us because we're good cops who do our jobs." Grayson didn't flinch. "If that's the case," he said calmly, "then you won't mind taking the stand and answering a few questions under oath, will you?" Harris froze, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Reynolds, meanwhile, had gone eerily quiet, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. The tension was suffocating, the air thick with unspoken accusations and mounting dread. As the judge called for a recess to review the evidence, Marcus was led back to his holding cell. His mind raced. He knew this was far from over. Harris and Reynolds were desperate, and desperate men were dangerous. He also knew that Grayson's evidence was just the tip of the iceberg. The Crestwood Police Department had been corrupt for years, and Marcus's case was only the beginning. But exposing the truth would come at a cost. Lives were at stake, including his own. He thought about his family, his friends, the people he had sworn to protect. Would they be safe once the full story came out? Or would the fallout destroy them, too? Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, the town of Crestwood was in chaos. News of the trial had spread like wildfire, and people were divided. Some believed Marcus was innocent, a victim of a broken system. Others saw him as a criminal trying to manipulate his way out of trouble. Protests erupted on the steps of the courthouse, with signs reading "Justice for Marcus" on one side and "Back the Blue" on the other. The media frenzy only added fuel to the fire, with every major network covering the story. Crestwood, once a quiet town no one had heard of, was now at the center of a national scandal. Back inside the courthouse, Grayson met with Marcus in a small, windowless room. "You did good in there," Grayson said, his tone softer now. "But this is just the beginning. Harris and Reynolds aren't going down without a fight, and neither is the department. We need to be ready for anything." Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. "I know," he said, "but we can't stop now. Too many people have been hurt because of them. This has to end." Grayson placed a hand on his shoulder. "It will," he said. "But you need to be careful. They're watching you, and they'll do whatever it takes to silence you." As the trial resumed, The tension in the room was palpable. The judge had reviewed Grayson's evidence and allowed it to be entered into the record. The prosecution, clearly rattled, tried to discredit Grayson, but their arguments fell flat. The evidence was too damning, too undeniable. Then, it was Harris's turn to take the stand. He walked up slowly, his usual swagger replaced by a nervous shuffle. The prosecutor began with easy questions, trying to paint him as a dedicated officer who had simply made a mistake. But when the defense took over, everything changed. "Officer Harris," Marcus's lawyer began, her voice sharp and precise, "can you explain why your bank account shows a deposit of $10,000 on the same day Marcus Johnson was arrested?" Harris stammered, his eyes darting to Reynolds, who looked away. I don't know," he said finally. "Maybe it was a bonus or something." The lawyer raised an eyebrow. "A bonus? From whom?" Harris hesitated, his face turning red. "I don't remember," he muttered. The lawyer didn't let up. "And what about the recording of you and Officer Reynolds discussing how to frame Marcus? Was that a bonus too?" Harris slammed his fist on the stand. "That's enough. I'm not answering any more questions." The judge called for order, but the damage was done. Harris's outburst had only made him look guiltier. Reynolds, still sitting in the gallery, looked like he wanted to disappear. The prosecution tried to recover, but it was clear the case was slipping through their fingers. Marcus, meanwhile, sat quietly, his mind racing. He knew this wasn't over. Harris and Reynolds were just pawns in a much larger game, and the people pulling the strings were still out there. Who were they? How far did the corruption go? And what would they do to protect their secrets? As the day came to a close, the judge announced that the trial would resume the next morning. The room emptied slowly, the weight of the day's revelations hanging heavy in the air. Marcus was led back to his cell, his thoughts a whirlwind of hope and fear. He had come so far, but the hardest part was yet to come. Outside, the protest continued, the chants growing louder as night fell. Crestwood was a town on the edge, and the truth was a spark that could either light the way or burn it all down. Marcus knew one thing for certain. When the trial resumed, nothing would ever be the same.